Thanks for joining us, Rory. We're really happy that you've agreed to be here and be our guest speaker tonight. Rory Dimond will be inviting us to discover more about the fascinating world of flies. Rory is an avid entomologist, wildlife gardener, and environmental educator. And I've had the pleasure of working alongside him for almost 7 years on Hampstead Heath with Heath Hands. But tonight he's here in his capacity as co-author of an upcoming book entitled A Photographic Guide to Flies of Britain and Ireland. And we'll be talking about some of the flies that are found on Hampstead Heath and elsewhere in the UK and the ecological roles they play. Over to you, Rory.
Thank you very much, Dave. Lovely introduction. I also am pleased to be presenting on flies to a group of avid naturalists. So I hope I don't have to do too much to convert you to understand that flies are fascinating creatures and worthy of your attention. But that's my main aim tonight. So I thought I'd have a very pretty title slide from you, but a bit of a spoiler in the start. So why am I talking to you about flies? Well, flies are what one entomologist calls the dark orders of insects. Lots of people love butterflies and moths. Lots more people love bees, and they have in the recent past as well. Lots of people are into beetles, but flies don't tend to get the same level of attention unless you're something that's very, very pretty, like a hoverfly, for example. But which is a shame, because flies are hugely diverse and they're hugely important in our ecosystem, so we need people looking out for them. This is where it all goes tumbling down, where I can't use my controls. Let's do that. And flies can be found absolutely everywhere, so there's really no excuse for not noticing flies. Okay. And Joe's already mentioned, I'm author of this upcoming book on the flies, Photographic Guide to the Flies of Britain and Ireland, which is the most complete photographic guide to flies that's ever been published. I'll be giving you a bit more context about it at the end. It looks like this. So when I talk about flies, how do you recognize a fly? Well, the way most people would say you recognize a fly is by counting the wings. So if you look at this picture of an idealized fly, it's a kind of snipe fly, you'll see it has only one pair of flying wings, and flies belong to the order Diptera, which means 2 wings. So flies have one pair of flying wings, and the hind wings are modified into these club-shaped organs called halteres. I'll just get the laser up and then you can see what I'm talking to you about. So just around here is the halteres. Most flying insects have 2 pairs of wings. You can see that on dragonflies. Bees and wasps also have 2 pairs of wings. I mentioned dragonflies. Unfortunately, a lot of common epithets of insects have the word fly in them, but a lot of them aren't actually flies. So caddisflies, dragonflies, mayflies, stoneflies, these things aren't actually true flies, not in the order Diptera. But funnily enough, there are some groups of true flies which have different names: mosquitoes, gnats, and midges. Those are all kinds of flies. So if you look, another way to recognize flies is there's an issue with just trying to count the wings, because often they'll sit with wings folded if they're feeding or if they're resting. And if a fly flies past you, then of course you can't count the wings. So one way is by the mouth parts. Flies do not have biting mandibles if you think of a beetle or a wasp. But they have a proboscis, which is a sort of suction feeding organ. And so you see here, this is a blowfly. This is Caliphora vomitoria, gingerbeard. A lot of you recognise buzzing around your houses in summer. And their proboscis is sort of hinged and has a pad on it for mopping up fluids. But there are some flies which have stiff, piercing mouth parts. It's really nicely demonstrated by this picture. You've got a robber fly, doing an ecosystem service by feeding on a stable fly. Robber fly is obviously a predator. It's got stiff piercing mouthparts sucking the life out of this stable fly, and stable fly is a blood feeder, so has stiff piercing mouthparts for sucking a little life out of mammals like us. So I have all sorts of modifications. There's all sorts of caveats of different fly families. So flies are split into two main groups. We have the suborder Brachycera, which means short-horned, which refers to the antennae. See, this is a close-up of a hoverfly face. It's got this very short antennae. Some flies have what looks like a little hair coming out of the antenna called an arista. You can also see the proboscis of this hoverfly here. And so those are the flies, when you typically think of a fly, a blowfly, a little housefly, a hoverfly, most of those flies are in the Brachycera that you're thinking of. But then when you start thinking about midges, crane flies, also flies, mosquitoes, biting flies like black flies, they belong to the lower Diptera. And this used to be known as the Nematocera, which meant threadhorns. And there used to be two suborders, but now it's a bit more complicated. Now we understand genetics and things. So the lower Diptera are the default flies, and the Brachycera are the group of more advanced, inverted commas, flies that are rows on them. And they're called Nematocera, meaning threadhorn, because their antennae are actually quite long, and they're made up of many beaded segments, as opposed to the 4 segments, or maybe 5, including the vista of other flies. You can also recognize flies by how they're having their huge, large eyes, and some of them are holoptic, which is a word I really love, which means that the flies actually meet in the middle of the head because they're so massive. This is a male horsefly, and they have particularly attractive eyes, horseflies. So, flies have a life cycle similar to butterflies and moths. They have a complete metamorphosis, so they lay eggs, which hatch into larvae, and the larvae molt through 4 or 5 instars before becoming a pupa or pupating, and then adult arises from that. So it's quite a recognisable life cycle, but lots of people aren't so aware that flies develop this way too. And of course, the larvae of lots of flies are termed as maggots. So this is a typical Brachycera life cycle, and the lower Diptera, similar life cycle. Think of a mosquito. I don't know if you've ever left a bucket of water out in your garden somewhere and then noticed these little wiggly tadpole type things suddenly arriving in it. They're mosquitoes, mosquito larvae, which filter feed in the water, and a lot of the lower Diptera are aquatic, and these larvae are really important to aquatic food chains as well. What I meant to mention, sorry, is that the larvae of the Brachycera maggoty things, we call them vermiforms, in worm shaped, whereas the larvae of the lower Diptera, you can see they're more basal because you can actually see the body parts of the adult sort of expressed in the larvae. You've got a head, you've got a long abdomen, whereas the maggots just look like a worm. And these larvae often have jaws, and they have a head with a hard head capsule as well. That's actually separate from the rest of the body. So flies are incredibly diverse, one of the what we call mega diverse orders of insects. There's about 160,000 species across the globe, obviously more to be discovered as there are with all insects. And these account for 1 in 10 species of all known invertebrates. So not just insects, it's all invertebrates. And a lot of sources will tell you that beetles are the most diverse order of insects, the most diverse order of animals in general. But now with genetic studies, we're looking at tiny little things like gall midges and realizing they are much more diverse in terms of species, and many more species than we thought there were originally. So flies may very well outstrip the beetles. In Britain Island, we also have an incredible number of species. So that's the latest figure as of the 2025 checklist of species in Britain and Ireland. So just over 100, just over 7,000 species, and split into 108 families. And there are 72 species recorded on the Heath, based on what Liz sent me from LNHS, Hampstead Heath survey section data, and from my record. I'm sure there are some other dipterists who recorded things elsewhere, but there's certainly more species to find on the Heath than that list. people often ask, what's the smallest, what's the biggest? So Britain's largest flies, it's a toss-up between these mating pair here, which are giant crane flies, which are an incredible looking beast, about 5 centimeters long, but they look much bigger to a human eye. This mating pair is actually inside the fence for the bird sanctuary pond, just below the ladies' pond. We found whilst we were doing some wildlife monitoring, so there's the slightly fatter female. She's got a little sticking out ovipositor there, male on top. What's intriguing is that the female clearly can't fly, so they've got malformed wing, but the male's not judging at all. And then, so that's the fly with the longest body and the widest wingspan in Britain, but of course it's pretty much stick thing. So the chunkiest fly, the greatest in terms of body mass that we have in Britain is the dark giant horsefly, which is also a very impressive beast. Fortunately, it tends to feed from cows and horses and large deer rather than humans. But I think horseflies are fantastic. If you look at the world's largest, even bigger, so this is a giant Midas fly from the tropics, which is 7 centimeters long. And if we get down to the smallest flies in Britain and in general, under a millimeter. And this is a teeny tiny fly that was discovered in 2013. It's a scuttlefly or a phoid. The reason it's so teeny tiny, this is all to scale. So this is a housefly silhouette in scale with a Midas fly, and in scale with this tiny little scuttlefly. It's teeny tiny because it lives inside ants. And this is the adult of one of these related species popping out of the head capsule of an ant where it's pupated. It's incredible the life cycles that some of these flies have. And so we have a real beautiful diversity of flies in Britain. These are all species I reckon you can find on the heath. I won't go into them all because I don't really have time, but it's just to showcase the fact that flies are very diverse in appearance, and there's some proper beauties. There's some nice metallic ones. Lots of flies mimic bees and wasps. You see this very fuzzy drone fly here. So flies have many functions in the ecosystems. I mentioned they're very important. The one that springs to mind is the flies are great decomposers. They're nature's recyclers, turning nutrient-rich waste into available nutrients of plants and fungi and other organisms. Flies are really, really underappreciated pollinators. They're actually some of the best pollinators that we have in Britain and across the world as well. We're going into that in a bit. And they are important for crop pollination too. It's not just about bees. And there are lots of predatory and parasitic flies and parasitoid flies. We're going into what that means in a bit. And they help to control populations of other insects. Some of these might be insects we consider pests that feed on our food crops or our garden plants. So they perform a service in that way too. And there's lots of other kinds of life cycles as well. I'll be going into these three and the herbivores tonight because I can't cover everything. And lots of flies are multifunctional in their life cycles. These are very familiar to you, I'm sure, especially if you have a garden compost bin or food waste bin. These are green bottle flies, and as larvae, as maggots, they feed on decaying flesh. But as adults, they will feed partly on this flesh for protein, but they also feed on pollen and nectar from flowers. And these blowflies, like green bottles, are excellent pollinators as well as waste disposers. So they're multifunctional and really helpful in the ecosystems. Of course, flies don't just eat things. They're also very good food for other species. So yeah, these pictures speak for themselves really. That wagtail's having a whale of a time. And there are some species which specialize entirely in feeding on flies. So this is a Fields digger wasp, Melinus avensis, and I photographed this one on the Kenwood estate. And she is carrying a hoverfly. She's carrying it by the proboscis, the indignity. What she's done with this fly is she's caught it probably on a flower. She's paralyzed it with her sting, and she's carrying it to a nest burrow where she'll lay an egg on it and entomb it, essentially, so the larvae can feed on the fly. And there are quite a few species of solitary wasps that specialize in catching flies. What's interesting here is you can tell the difference between the hoverfly and the wasp by the antennae. Very short antennae hoverfly, very long on the wasp. and she has a biting mandible she's holding onto the proboscis with. So it's going to decomposers and things people often think of as really horrible, but are performing a very good service. This is a very familiar material on Hampstead Heath. That was, yes, I did take a photo of this as courtesy of my parents' greyhound. But flies are very efficient at dealing with these things that we don't want to see or step in. And so there are lots of species, as you'll know, on carrion, on dead animals, and there are a succession of fly species that will feed on at different stages of decomposition of a carcass. So this is a flesh fly. They arrive first off as soon as something dies, pretty much flesh flies are on it, along with the blowflies. But then this species is a skipper fly, and there are some skippers that lay their eggs on bones. And even told, even if you chuck a few chicken bones out in your lawn, you'll attract some of these skipper flies. And many more species feed on decaying plant matter as well, not just dead animals. And these help the nutrient cycling, helping break things down. You notice this is a Drosophila Suzuki'i, spot-winged Drosophila, which is fairly recent arrival to the UK, very easy to spot because they've got these spotted wings, unlike your household fruit flies. So look out for those. And flies also feed upon rotting wood and things associated with rotting wood. So we term these saproxylic, all organisms associated with dead wood are saproxylic invertebrates. And there are over 200 species of flies in the UK which utilise this resource. I'm sure most of you know decaying wood is an essential habitat for so many species in the UK. About a third of our insects rely on it. Flies are no exception. And some of Britain's rarest flies are members of the saproxylic community, because they need very, very old trees to survive, essentially. And they'll develop in different kinds of, different microhabitats and different kinds of rot in the wood. I don't think I saw this in your list, Liz. Tony might be able to correct me that he has found it. This is Brachiopa insensiliis. It is a species of hoverfly. It's quite a weird looking one. They mainly lay their eggs on sap runs, which are like weeping, yeasty sap weeps on horse chestnuts. They also go for sycamores as well. So this is a species we could be looking out for on our horse chestnuts, unfortunately sickening with the leaf mining moths. And they turn up even on street trees and sort of municipal parks as well. So worth looking for these on the side of a horse chestnut trees where there's sap runs. This species is a type of splinter crane fly which feeds on the rotting sapwood of poplars. So it's another one you can look out for, fairly distinctive because it's all black and it has a yellowish holtez. And there are lots of flies that feed upon fungi and the decaying wood, but I'm afraid there's no hope in identifying fungus gnats in the field or from photos, but there are lots of them, and they are interesting enough. And then this is quite a spectacular one. It's Xylurta segnis. It's orange-belted hoverfly, orange-belted leaf-walk hoverfly, and they move a lot like a wasp, a lot like a spider wasp, or a kind of parasitic wasp. And they're not fussy about decaying wood they breed on, even breed on wet sawdust. They're a nice species to look out for in summer. They run across leaves in a jerky fashion, and they're fairly big, so quite obvious and nice to photograph. So, of course, the Heath has over 450 veteran trees and a really well-managed decaying wood resource, thanks to our arboriculture team. So I'm sure there are a lot of species awaiting discovery, saproxylic flies awaiting discovery on the Heath. Here are a couple of very good-looking ones. Common copperback hoverfly is something that I'm sure we could find on the Heath if we look for it. They breed in chappy tree wings, a bit like the Brachiopa. And look at this beast, absolutely incredible looking beast. It's a wasp mimicking crane fly, and the Ctenophora flava. It's a Ctenophora crane fly, and yeah, absolutely spectacular. And it's sort of a matter of chance whether you see one, but they are present in London, even though they're nationally rare. So worth looking out for these. So there are flies that feed on living plant matter as well as decaying plant matter, and a lot of these flies develop as larvae inside. I'll just hide this, sorry. develop as larvae inside plants. Because maggots aren't really very good at coping with drying effect of sunlight and things like that. And so I know that there are members of the LNHS really into leaf mines. This is a leaf mine that's in wild geranium, meadow cranesbill, that's it. And there are a lot of different kinds of leaf mining flies. And one of the most recognisable is Phytomyza ulysses, the holly leaf miner. As you're making your Christmas wreaths, so look out for any leaves that have these sort of blotch mines on them. That's made by a tiny little fly from the family Agromyzidae, and lots of these are agromyzid mines, but lots of other species of flies also make mines. And so what they're doing, the larvae is living inside the leaf, and it's actually eating out these channels, and all the blackish bits you see are the frass or the poo of the larva. And you can recognise some of the species from the shape of the mine as well. Lots of flies also bore into roots and stems as larvae. This is a species very... Oh, where's my laser gone? Come on, laser. Right. The species on the right is one that's... The brown one is one that's very familiar to wildlife interpreters on the heath, because it turns up a lot in the sweep nets when you're sweeping through long grass. So they mine the stems of grasses. And there are flies that feed on bulbs as well. And this one is the Myothropa, Merodon equestris, not Myothropa, which is a bumblebee mimic hoverfly, very convincing one. And the larvae are not very well liked by plant nurseries because they will feed inside roots of daffodils and other bulbs. But honestly, I think I'd rather love having these bumblebee mimics in the garden. Interestingly enough, even though they're very common everywhere now, they were originally imported with bulbs, probably by the Victorians. And some of these herbivorous flies, form galls as well. So I'm sure lots of you know what galls are, but essentially they're a growth on a plant, it's abnormal growth that's caused by another organism influencing it. So there are lots of insects and also mites and bacteria and viruses and all sorts that cause galls, but a lot of them are also caused by flies. And a lot of them are caused by the gall midges, which I talked about earlier as being very diverse order. And these are some selected highlight ones I think you might be able to find on the heath. I'm not so sure about the bracken one, but that's one I included because it's got a lovely common name. It's called the tiny black pudding fly, or little black pudding fly, and that's found on bracken. And yes, so they form these galls by interfering with plant hormones, which is pretty incredible, remarkable bit of evolution. And there are other species of flies that produce galls as well as the gall midges. And here's one that I think lots of us will be fairly familiar with, but if you're not, it's a very easy one to find. So go into any of the creeping thistle patches on the heath, look for big, thick, round, sometimes egg-shaped galls on the stems of the creeping thistle. They're made by this very fetching fly called a thistle gall fly, Urophora cardui, and they're fairly common, but really they're a nice species to find. So, as well as feeding on the plants themselves, they're also, as I said, flies are taking pollen and nectar, and they're very, very important pollinators. And pollination by flies even has its own name, called myophyly. In the UK, we have around 1,500 species of flies that pollinate. Even midges, mosquitoes, and horseflies will pollinate, so they do have a point. Lots of people argue, couldn't we do without them? But they're doing a lot of work behind the scenes that we don't see when they're not biting us. And flies from many, many different families that are pollinators as well. And this one here is a St. Mark's fly. And even though they might look very gangly and they don't seem to do very much apart from fly around courting, they do also feed on nectar, and they've got very hairy bodies, so act as pollinators. So this big bristly parasitic fly, the Echinifera, all those bristles and hairs, and they pick up pollen. Hoverflies are the ones that we notice the most because they're very, very colourful, and they often mimic bees and wasps, which that mimicry is aided by their presence on flowers as well. But there are lots of other different kinds of flies that pollinate. And they are really important, the second most important pollinators after bees, some people say. But they also perform functions that bees don't. And so they'll fly in poorer weather. Plants that grow in shade, so woodland plants rely more on flies for pollination, as do a lot of alpine plants, because flies can fly in cooler, generally fly in cooler conditions than bees, and bumblebees being a bit of an exception. And flies, because they don't go back and forth to a nest, they'll fly over greater distances to forage. So in, say, large crop fields, there'll be more flies than bees in the interior of the field pollinating the crop, things like oil seeds, stuff like that. I mentioned woodland alpine plants. And yeah, so here's some evidence, if you didn't believe me, that mosquitoes and midges are pollinators. So there's a mosquito on an ivy flower, photographed one night. And then this is, these are some biting midges, which are feeding from a sunspurge flower, which I was really pleased to capture. They've got a male with feathery antennae there. Moving on. And so actually, a lot of flies tend to have a very short proboscis when they feed on flowers. So they prefer open flowers. If we have a look at the slide here, so a lot of daisy type flowers, ragworts, umbellifers, so things like hogweed, cow parsley, wild angelica. So that's what most flies are visiting, is these very shallow, open structured flowers, and ivy is hugely important to them as well. But there are exceptions, of course. Some flies are evolved to be very specialist pollinators and have much longer proboscis. A lot of people recognise the bee flies, a lovely sign of spring. If you haven't noticed bee flies before, if you see an insect anytime from around March to end of May, maybe even early June, it looks a bit like a bumblebee, but behaving more like a hoverfly. And they've got this long, permanently extended stiff proboscis. And they sort of like hoverfly, more like a hummingbird than a than a hoverfly in the way they fly. They're very good at hovering, and it's amazing to watch them actually manoeuvring this really long, unwieldy-looking proboscis like a saber into the tiny aperture of flowers like green alkanet and forget-me-not here. Dagger flies are interesting because they also feed on insects, but they do imbibe nectar as well as sugary energy to keep themselves going. And this is one of my favourite hoverflies, common snout hoverfly, because I was thinking it looks a bit like Gonzo from the Muppets. And they're very good at reaching deep into flowers. And these are all species you can find on the heath, certainly. So myophyly, so some flowers are termed myophilous because they actually rely more on flies than other pollinators. And they have certain traits which attract flies. And we talked about flies being decomposers. A lot of these plants have evolved flowers that smell foul. I don't know if you've really sniffed an ivy flower. Some people say it smells like certain bodily fluids. And hawthorn flowers, some people love them. I personally find that they absolutely reek. I think they smell of a public toilet. And that's to attract flies, as hawthorn is pollinated by a lot of flies. And so most of these flowers that attract flies aren't particularly showy, because flies are attracted more by the scent of things than by the visuals, although they can also see in UV like bees do. And a lot of the flowers are either white, green or yellow, which seems to appeal to flies more than, say, blue flowers. And as I mentioned, a lot of them are simple in structure, so the flies can reach them with their small proboscis. But some flowers go the opposite direction, and they want to exclusively attract very tiny flies, so they make themselves as inaccessible as possible. So I don't know how many of you know about pollination of our maculatum. You call it cuckoo pints or lords and ladies. A very distinctive flower, and it's a species of arum, and it's got this organ in the center called a calyx. How I can see that, I'm going to turn my razor. So calyx in the middle, which is partly the reason for its common name, the lord part. So there's an incredible adaptation these plants have. So they can actually warm themselves up by metabolic action. So the flower is warmer than the surrounding air, and this spreads the scent, the volatile chemicals out from the flower. And it stinks, absolutely reeks if you get up to it, of cowpats, really specifically of cowpats, bizarrely enough. And and so this attracts tiny little flies, and specifically these flies called moth flies. And they enter the flower. This is a view of the inside of the flower. It's been cut open. They'll enter, go down the spadix, past these fleshy spines, and then they'll end up where the anthers are of the flower, but they can't get back past these backward pointing spines. So they're essentially trapped in there, even though they didn't actually come in for a meal of nectar. They thought they were getting a nice meal of cow dung, and now they're running around trying to find their way out and actually just rubbing against all the anthers and getting pollen covered on their bodies. But eventually the plant does release them. The spines break down over a short amount of time, and so the flies are released. And flies aren't really the cleverest of animals. They'll then be duped into flying into another cowpat smelling arum flower, and that's how this plant pollinates itself. It's very convoluted, but make sure it's got these exclusive pollinators and the moth flies. I thought I'd mention some of the flowers that you can look on specifically to if you want to find flies. And I was just thinking about the sorts of flowers that we have on the heath that particularly attract them. And as I said, any sort of daisy type flowers, flowers in the daisy family, dandelions, I'll always sing the praises of. They're fantastic for all kinds of pollinators. And thistles, ragworts, essential for pollinators, and yarrows as well. So yeah, I'll let you take this in rather than reading them all off to you. But in autumn, the best flower to look for flies on in autumn is ivy. Any pollinators are absolutely heaving with them, and you do get some quite spectacular hoverflies and parasitic flies on ivy too. So all through the year, flies will be on these. And even if you look at flowering mahonia, non-native shrub that have in the garden spaces, there'll be flies on there on sunny days as well, and you can look for. So yeah, when you're out in the field, if you want to find some flies, have a look on some of these flowers. Blossoming shrubs are very important too. Things like hawthorn, blackthorn, very good for flies. Apologies, every time I click on something, it seems to change. There we go. And just very briefly, we do rely on flies for some of our food as well, and they are important pollinators of quite a range of crops. So soft fruits, orchard fruits. I mentioned they go on tree blossoms and includes our orchard trees. In the tropics, blowflies are some of the most important pollinators of things like mangoes and avocados. Oil seeds pollinated by St. Mark's flies, as well as lots of other pollinators too. And this is a drone fly, type of hoverfly, maybe it's a honeybee. And agricultural companies have started farming drone flies for use in greenhouses for pollination systems of things like peppers and tomatoes. So next time you eat pepper or tomato or something grown in a greenhouse in Spain, it might be pollinated by a drone fly. And something we all can't live without. These are cocoa beans, and the cocoa tree, in a slightly similar fashion to the lords and ladies flower, it's a very convoluted flower that's very difficult to access, and it's pollinated by biting midges. So it's really important in where cocoa is grown that they're grown near to natural rainforests so the biting midges can breed. A lot of you didn't realise the chocolate came from a midge. Some sources say that bats pollinate cocoa beans, but it's not true, I'm afraid. It's midges. So as well as pollinating crops, flies also safeguard our crops from other insects who might want to eat them. And a lot of flies are predatory, which often surprises some people. And they might be predatory as adults or as larvae or both. Some adult flies are predatory but have herbivorous larvae, vice versa. And as I mentioned, they have a piercing proboscis to be able to get into the insects and feed on them, and feed on the hemolymph, like the body fluids of insects. And some of them even inject venom. So the robber flies are venomous, and they inject venom and enzymes into their prey, which paralyzes the prey and liquidizes it at the same time. And a lot of these flies have very strong spiny legs. I'll make sure you can see a laser. So this is a yellow dung fly, which breed in dung, but as adults they're predatory and pollinators. And you see this leg is almost like that of a praying mantis, it's called raptorial forelimbs for grasping. So they actually grab flies in flight or off vegetation to feed on them. Yeah, I'm really pleased to get this photo of one feeding on another smaller fly. And yeah, the robber flies are some of the most spectacular predators. They've got long spiny legs. They even have a beard which stops the struggling prey from damaging their mouth parts. And what they'll often do is similar fashion to some dragonflies. They'll sit on a perch on a long grass stem or something, wait for something to fly by, and they'll fly up and grab it with their spiny legs and then inject it with venom and feed on it. And the largest robber flies in Britain, we don't get them on the heath, but the hornet robber fly, they've actually been recorded eating hornets. So they are pretty efficient, gnarly predators. Other And so, yeah, even as larvae, flies can be predatory, and a lot of them live in the soil or in dung or decaying wood and feed on other insect larvae in that habitat. This is a robber fly larva that's chowing down a very big meal of a dung beetle grub. And so I can't find a photo of this, probably for obvious reasons, but there's an excellent illustration. And some of the most beloved fly larvae, most beloved maggots, if that can be a phrase, are the hoverfly larvae, which feed on aphids. So they're really good biocontrol in agriculture for controlling numbers of pest species. And hoverfly larvae, one of the few fly larvae that are actually active and crawl around on vegetation, and you can find them amongst plants. And they have these hooked mouth parts that they use to, like a vampire, strike at aphids, and then this one is literally holding the aphid up to drain its body fluids. So yeah, very voracious predators. Lots of people sing the praises of ladybirds. Not so many people know how efficient hoverflies are as as aphid predators too. And so yeah, talk about flies that actually consume and feed on other animals. There are also flies which are termed parasitoid. So these are what you might think is parasitic flies, but parasitoids are animals where they have a parasitic relationship, but they actually end up eventually killing the host rather than letting the host live as part of their life cycle. So there's a group of flies called the whole family called the Tachinidae, and they're parasitic flies, Tachinidae. And lots of them lay their eggs on caterpillars. Some also lay their eggs on true bugs. This is Phasia hemiptera, which is called the bat-winged Phasia. Very distinctive, very huge eyes, very broad, thick set in general. The males have even broader dark wings. And they belong to a suborder of the Tachinidae that lay their eggs on true bugs, like this unfortunate shield bug. It's got these eggs stuck to it. The eggs have got spears on them to stick into the exoskeleton of the insect before the larva hatches out and feeds on its insides thing. And there are some little bizarre flies, a group called the Pepunculidae, or the big-eyed flies. Very obvious reasons. They've got these massive eyes. They are parasitic on frog hoppers and leaf hoppers, and so they're very important biocontrols. These are sap-sucking insects. The lovely bee flies that we just looked at, and you look at them, they're all fuzzy and sweet, and you think butter wouldn't melt. That's unless you're a mining bee, and they lay their eggs, scatter their eggs around your nest. The bee fly larvae then hatch out, wander into the bee's nest, and they find, hopefully for them, lots of pollen stores gathered by the female mining bee. I should clarify, these are solitary bees nest in the ground. And so they'll find the pollen stores, start feeding on the pollen stores. They'll let the bee larva hatch out, and also share the pollen stores until they reach a certain instar and molt, and then decide that they're through with eating pollen and they want some meat, and they start chowing down on the bee larva. So even the sweetest looking things can have very grim life cycles. That's nature for you. And this, what I think is a fairly ridiculous looking thing, is a hunchback fly, an acrosoid fly. I like to find these on the heath itself, but I just include them because they're really interesting. They've got these huge inflated bodies. Female has this huge inflated abdomen because it's absolutely packed full of eggs. And then these tiny little eyes that are almost entirely made up of eyes. And even though this doesn't look like a very effectual predator, it probably has the most metal of fly life cycles in that it eats spiders, it turns the tables. So similar to the bee flies, they scatter their eggs around, but the hunchback flies are actually just quarter over some long grass or vegetation and just spray as many eggs as they can onto it, and it's a numbers game. So when the eggs hatch out, the larvae race around like caterpillars, they're trying to search for a spider to latch onto. And once they're latched onto the spider, it takes a long time, but eventually it's curtains for the spider. Excuse me. And this is the puparium of the acrosoid fly on this poor laceweaver spider here. And so there are flies that will eat pretty much anything. They're very diverse insect parasitoids. These are just some of them. But from a human perspective, as I mentioned, a lot of these are very good for us to have around because they control insect pests. Here's another Tachinifera. So the parasitic flies, I mentioned, a lot of them feed on caterpillars, things like cutworms, big noctuid moth larvae. Hoverflies feeding on aphids, of course. So that's a hoverfly larva just so stuck on an aphid. It's a larva of the marmalade hoverfly, which is a nice, recognizable species. It's got this orange abdomen, hence the name marmalade, and it has black bands, but also little black moustaches between the bands that help distinguish it. And what's interesting about marmalade hoverfly is that most of them that arrive in the UK, well, most of them that we see in the UK in late spring and summer are migrants. So they've migrated all the way from southern Europe or North Africa and arrived on our shores. Some years you get eruption years, birders will know the term eruptions, where you get masses of them arriving at once. And similar to, if you're into butterflies, the painted lady butterflies will get some big painted lady years. You also get some massive eruption years on marmalade hoverflies and can be absolutely everywhere. And so there's some years when we have this huge army of aphid controllers arriving on our shores and helping out our garden plants and our crops. This is a much more obscure one. This is we haven't decided a common name yet for this one in the book, but the Chiromyidae. And their larvae feed on aphids or on scale insects, depending on the species. And there are lots of other flies which are also predating all these insects that we gardeners love to hate. So on to flies that don't necessarily kill the things that they're feeding on, but these are some of the flies that I think have the most interesting life cycles, so I save them till last. So we have some flies are ectoparasites, which means they live on the outside of things. And even though we think of mosquitoes, horseflies, midges, and things that come along to bite us, not bite, but come along to feed on our blood, and then they're off. What they're doing is they come to feed on blood because the blood's a really good source of protein for the females, and that helps stimulate their egg development. So it's usually the female flies that are biting. And then they'll fly off to lay their eggs elsewhere, and feeding on blood is just the food for them, not really what defines their lives. Whereas there are some flies which evolved to be really specialist ectoparasites and live a bit like a flea or a tick would on a host. So this is a swift, and this is the swift louse fly, Cretulina pallida. So these flies, for a start, they can't fly. They have very narrow wings. They have very distended abdomen in the females, which are not full of eggs. They have a very interesting life cycle. So they do live on the swifts, they feed on the swifts, they'll fly around on them. The poor swifts, it's like one of us carrying a load of literal crabs around when we're walking around because of the scale. And they must be very irritating to the swift, but all these louse flies, hippoboscids in the family, they'll have this flattened body and very stiff hairs, and sometimes they've been found in the stomach contents of swifts, but they're pretty much adapted not to be eaten by the host. And so they'll latch on to the adult swifts. When they nest, they'll drop off into the nest and feed on the nestlings as well. But curiously enough, they don't follow the swifts on migration. So what they'll do is, instead of laying eggs like most flies would, these actually give birth to live young. And shortly after they've given birth to a maggot, the maggot pupates and it sits around waiting in the nest until the next year and the next lot of swift nestlings to parasitize. And related to swift louse fly, if you look out for one species of fly this year that will really make recorders happy, look out for the pigeon louse fly. So this is one I photographed near Southend Green, and it was just on the garden wall. I thought, oh, that's interesting. There's a louse fly there. I've never seen a louse fly out in the wild before. And took a picture of it, posted it on Twitter, and then Denise Warren, the national recorder of louse flies, got back to me and said, this is a species that's only the second record in the UK. Curious enough, they parasitise pigeons. You'd think they'd be much more common, but yeah, there's real data records. Look out for these. They've got these bristles on their thorax. I'm going to wrap up very soon. It's going to be 1 minute. And here is a bat fly, which is even more specialised than the louse flies that feed on birds. They give birth inside the roosts of bats, and they live on the bats. They have no wings and no eyes. They just live as a parasite. And some beekeepers might know about the bee louse, which doesn't actually feed on the bees. It feeds on the nectar they transfer between each other as they feed each other, and the larvae live on the cell cappings. And there are even some flies that scavenge from spiders called the jackal flies. So, thank you very much for listening to me rant about flies. I hope it's given you lots of food for thought, and that you're now fascinated by them. If you want to find out more, there is an upcoming book. Unfortunately, it's not quite ready for Christmas. We're still doing the proofreading. We want to make sure it's absolutely technically accurate rather than getting it out for Christmas. So apologies about that if you have already pre-ordered it. But it's out in February, and you can pre-order it up to the end of December. And here's a little preview for you as well. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully some of you will have some questions.
That was a brilliant talk, Rory. Thank you so much for that. And yes, we do have some questions.